Hello and welcome. If you haven't already, I invite you to please click subscribe. There's no obligation, and it allows you to be notified of all new chapters. Additional information about the story, including the author, chapter warnings, and rating, can be found in the description below. All credit goes to the original author. All That Remains by Orphan Account. Chapter 24. Shadowed Elves. Boromir, son of Denethor, was feeling conflicted. His thoughts and emotions pulled him in different directions, tearing at him like rabid dogs, and making him unable to find peace. Even in the beautiful garden in Rivendell that he sat in, he felt both awe and unease. Here in the Elven realm it was peaceful, startlingly so, and as a man who had grown up under the threat of the shadow, the tranquility of the hidden valley left him feeling disturbed. Despite himself, Boromir was as jumpy as a nervous foal, twitching at every sudden sound and expecting an attack to come at any moment. His general wariness about the elves was not helping to calm him. Boromir would not call himself prejudiced or closed-minded, but he was not comfortable around the mysterious immortals. Whispers of old stories he had heard as a child concerning the elves plagued the back of his mind. Tales of stolen children, witches, seducing spells, and curses that would make a man lose his mind wormed their way through his thoughts, speaking to him in a voice that sounded unnervingly like his father's. The man of Gondor ignored said voice and thoughts to the best of his ability, instead vowing to try to follow Faramir's way and judge the elves for himself. Boromir was trying to keep an open mind, he really was, but old feelings and a bit of anger continued to sneak up on him. He loved and cherished the peace of the realm, but also felt slight bitterness that Rivendell managed to be untouched by war, while his city lived under constant threat. Even in the garden, his thoughts returned to Gondor, and the man grimaced at thin air. This year had been the first he had accepted Lord Elrond's invitation to stay in Rivendell for a few days, and Boromir found that he could not fully be glad or regret deciding to remain. It had been the concerned, hopeful expression in Elrond's wise eyes that had made the decision for him, and it was only once he had been shown to a room and had looked into a mirror that the man had realized why the Elf Lord had stared at him so. Boromir had led many battles and seen many warriors lose the will to fight endlessly, and in his own eyes he saw the emotions he had never wanted to see: hopelessness and despair. He was tired with fighting a war that refused to end. As such, even with his wariness and inability not to worry about his home, Boromir felt a little better having stayed in the peaceful Rivendell. A week of rest and recuperation for his mind and will had been good for him, despite his warrior's mind waiting for the next tragedy to strike. That was why he would begin his journey home tomorrow, he decided. He had been away from Gondor for long enough. A distant, alarmed cry sent the man to his feet, jerkily reaching for the sword that was not hanging from his hip. He did not stop to think about it as he ran towards the continuing shouts, someone speaking desperately in a language that made no sense to Boromir's ears. Elvish? He pushed his thoughts aside, his ever-ready warrior mentality taking over. Something had happened. Something was wrong. He needed to investigate and prepare for attack. There was no such thing as peace anymore. The man did not enter so much as burst into the room the cries were coming from, his gray eyes taking in the scene before him in an instant. The ranger from the councils, whom he had heard was called both Estelle and Strider, and one of Elrond's twin sons was kneeling over an unmoving form. The elf on the floor was the exact image of the one fretting over him, and was undeniably unconscious. His dark hair was splayed about his pale face, his body was limp, and, most alarmingly, his eyes were closed. Boromir had been around the elves enough to know that, for them, closed eyes was never good. The conscious twin was the one he had heard, shouting frantically at his unresponsive brother. Although he could not understand the flowing words, it was terribly clear that the twin was begging his brother to awaken. It was also clear that the panicking twin was getting in Strider's way, the man's voice harsh and low as he spoke to the elf in that kind's language. Again, the meaning of his words were clear, despite Boromir's inability to translate them. "Get out of my way so I can help him." Even though he appeared to have discovered the source of the disturbance, the constant thought of danger, danger, danger repeated itself at the back of Boromir's mind. He remained alert even as he approached the trio. "What happened?" the man asked. The ranger looked up at him, relief flashing across his features. "Elrohir collapsed. I can't figure out what is wrong because Aladan refuses to let me check him." There was taut frustration in the man's tone, and he glared at his brother. "If you could get him away so I could do what I need to do without him hovering, I would greatly appreciate it." The elf glowered at him, not appreciating Strider speaking about him as if he were not there. Anger, fear, and protectiveness warred in his expression, alien yet oddly familiar. Boromir had seen that expression before, on his own face. It was then that he recalled that Elladan was the older twin, and Elrohir the younger. For a moment, it was Faramir who was lying on the floor in front of the man, and he winced, shuddering. "I am a healer as well," Elladan snapped. "I can—" "You're panicking and emotional," Strider said coolly. "You're too close to Elrohir, and so you cannot think straight, and you are letting your emotions cloud your judgment. You only hinder more than help, so please, let me help him." The twin opened his mouth to protest, but Boromir put a hand on his shoulder, drawing the elf's attention to him. "Let him do what he needs to," he said softly. "Your brother will be fine." He tried to convey his thoughts through his words, trying to tell the other older brother that he understood. He knew what it was like to see a sibling injured before him. Elladan looked ready to lash out at him and protest, but when Silver met gray eyes, the older twin stopped. He nodded once and allowed the man to pull him back, finally letting Strider thoroughly check Elrohir. Instead of looking at his brothers, Elladan instead studied Boromir. The silver eyes of the elf pierced the man, looking deep into his soul. He forced himself to not look away, gazing back at Elladan steadily. The staring contest went on for several minutes before the twin broke the silence. "You have a younger brother, don't you?" the elf said. The man barely hesitated before responding, "Yes." "I see," the elf said softly, and turned away, watching the ranger with such intensity, Boromir was surprised he did not burst into flames. An uneasy silence fell over the room as Strider went about, checking Elrohir's vitals and making sure he did not hit his head. The man remained calm and collected, going about his business with careful detachment, though Boromir guessed that inside he was screaming with worry. After only a few minutes, he sat back on his heels, expression dark. "I cannot find any reason for his collapse. It seems like he just fainted." "Elrohir doesn't faint," Elladan growled, fired up once more. "Something is wrong. He was perfectly fine one minute, and the next he just—" A small groan interrupted the coming tirade. All eyes went to the younger twin, who shifted and winced, opening bleary silver eyes. Then, with an abruptness that startled the still edgy Boromir, the elf gasped and leapt to his feet, swaying on the spot and talking frantically in Elvish. The man from Gondor could only watch in alarm as Elrohir raced out the door like an elf possessed. Elladan shouted something in the same language. Perhaps learning Elvish was a good idea, before the older twin and the ranger ran after their brother. Boromir followed as well, forced to run at a full pelt in order to keep the elves and Strider in sight. They turned left, right, left, the man losing his sense of direction as the chase led them through the hidden valley. His still alert mind noticed that the halls were oddly empty for the time of day. Where had everyone gone? Up ahead, Elrohir burst through another door, leaping forward with an indistinct cry. Boromir arrived in the hallway in time to see the twin tackle an elf, sending them both to the ground with a crash. The man only took a second to take in the scene. Most importantly, he noted the unconscious golden-haired elf on the floor, and the sword in Elrohir's target's hand. His mind was quick to realize what had happened, though it cried out in rejection of his thoughts. After all, why would an elf attack another? Strider and Elladan seemed to be having similar thoughts, both frozen and unmoving as they watched their brother grapple with the other. A sword was still gripped in the antagonist's hand, Elrohir hard-pressed to keep it away from him. For once, Boromir was the one who reacted first, grabbing the other elf's sword hand and twisting it painfully, forcing him to release the weapon. Rather than cry out in pain, the elf snarled, turning towards him, and the man caught a glimpse of demonic black eyes, before the elf broke away from Elrohir, leaping for the captain like a rabid animal. Boromir gave a yell of surprise as the elf brought him to the ground. He gasped and choked as pale hands wrapped around his throat, staring with horror as his eyes met enraged black. All signs of reason and sanity were gone from the elf's gaze, leaving nothing behind but rage and bloodlust. Boromir's struggles startled Strider and Elladan out of their shock. They and Elrohir all lunged for the possessed elf, pulling him off of the man. Quick as a blink, the immortal struck out again, foot meeting Elladan's chest and sending the older twin flying back. He landed hard, hand to his chest and gasping for breath. The deranged elf's strength quickly became known as he twisted and fought in the three remaining warriors' grasps. Boromir could barely hold down the arm he found himself pinning, watching out of the corner of his eye as the other two were barely able to do the same. "Elladan, knock him unconscious," Strider shouted, grimacing as the black-eyed elf snapped at him with his teeth. The older twin stumbled to his feet, closed fists slamming down on the crazed elf's head. The terrifying black eyes closed, and their enemy went limp. The danger passing, Boromir leaned back, breathing ragged from the brief yet intense struggle. "Are you all right, Elladan?" Strider asked his brother. The older twin nodded mutely, face slightly pale. "That hurt more than it should have," he said, voice slightly strained. "I don't think anything is broken, though." The ranger began looking over the unconscious golden-haired elf, who Boromir could now identify as Glorfindel. "He was struck from behind," the man reported, his brow furrowed. "If we hadn't arrived, Liffin would have killed him." "Why would an elf murder one of their kin?" Boromir asked. "I thought that kinslaying was one of the greatest crimes an elf could commit." He did not miss the significant glance that passed between the three sons of Elrond. "You know what is happening, don't you?" he stated. "You know why Liffin attacked Lord Glorfindel, and why his eyes were like that." The twins looked unwilling to share any information, but Strider looked the captain straight in the eye. "Yes, Liffin is known as a shadowed elf, an elf infected with darkness. Before now, the darkness was barely noticeable and caused little change in behavior, but now Liffin has transformed into a bloodthirsty orc," Elladan spat. "How did this happen? And why now? There were no warnings or signs that he would become like this." "It is not just him," Elrohir said, a wild look lingering in his silver eyes. "It is all of them. Their auras." He shuddered. His twin whirled to face him. "You can sense them?" he demanded. Wide, horrified eyes met his. "How can you not sense them? The darkness was so great I collapsed under the strength of it. It is like a mountain is pressing down on me." His eyes squeezed shut, and he pressed a hand over them, as if doing so would banish the sickening auras that were overwhelming him. Anger, wrath, savage bloodlust. These aren't elves anymore. The darkness has devoured their souls. A single, agonized scream interrupted Elrahir, and 4 sets of eyes turned instinctively towards the sound. Outside, beneath the shining sun, the beautiful trees and exquisite arches of Rivendell, elves fought elves. Boromir could only watch in horror as a male elf stabbed the female who had screamed, stabbed her in the throat, leaving her to bleed out. He watched as another elf evaded his attacker's sword, shouting and pleading in Elvish with a bewildered, terrified, and betrayed expression on his face. His attacker, who looked so similar to his prey that they must be close kin, ignored the other's words, coldly stepping forward and plunging his blade into his victim's chest, turning away without a second thought. Even from a distance, Boromir could see the elf's demonic black eyes. Even from a distance, the man could see the shocked, confused expressions on the defenders' faces as their fellow warriors turned on them. Here, up a level in a mockingly peaceful hall, he witnessed the peace of Rivendell shattering. Brother killing brother, friend murdering friend, mother killing son. Most still light elves were without weapons, but the shadowed elves were all armed. Outside was not the beginnings of a battle, but a massacre. It was not one of the twins, but Strider who took charge. "Elladan, gather the warriors. Elrahir, take Glorfindel to Adda. Boromir, grab Liffin's sword and come with me. Be ready to fight." His tone was the commanding and harsh voice of a leader, and the 3 obeyed without question. The twins darted off, many questions for the younger left unanswered, and Boromir followed the ranger, the elven sword gripped tightly in his hand. They were running, Strider only armed with a dagger, and he only with a sword. The man of Gondor cursed himself for not carrying his own weapons around the hidden valley. He knew in his head that Strider was as well. "How many shadowed elves are there in Rivendell?" the captain wanted to know. The ranger's expression was dark. 358. There are only 20 guards, so unless some warriors are returning from patrol, everyone else is weaponless. He gritted his teeth, fear, anger, and despair warring in his silver eyes. "We were fools to think ourselves safe here. We should have known better than to believe in peace." There was no more time for talk, for they had reached their enemy. Out near the entrance of Rivendell, the elves bitterly fought. A few warriors able to incapacitate or kill the shadowed elves and take weapons from them. The first thing Strider did upon his arrival was strike down a shadowed elf, taking his sword and raising his voice to be heard over the chaos. "Do not hold back. They are no longer your friends or even elves any longer. The darkness has taken them. Fight them as you would fight orcs. Fight without mercy, for you will receive none." Bright, colored elf eyes hardened, and expressions grew cold, and with a mental strength and determination Boromir knew he could never match, the elves fought their former kin, friends, and comrades. The man of Gondor rallied his own courage and strength, leaping into the fray to confront the first shadowed elf he met. Mindful of the demonized elf's strength and speed, he resolved to dispatch of them in as few strikes as possible. Boromir blocked a blow aimed at his side and delivered his own horizontal slash. The blade was lighter than he was used to, but its weight allowed him to swing it faster and harder. The shadowed elf did not expect the human to be so quick, and was unused to its new strength. Metal sank into flesh. They are no longer elves, they are no longer elves. Blood flowed from clear, pale, glowing skin. They are no longer elves, they are no longer elves. A voice screamed, oddly beautiful even when in agony. They are no longer elves, they are no longer elves. Unseeing eyes remained black even in death, still holding the unnerving glow of the Eldar. They are no longer elves, they are no longer elves. An immortal, once light and free, was cut down without mercy by his sword, the creature's life severed forever. They are no longer elves, they are no longer elves. They were no longer elves, they were shadowed elves. They were creatures of darkness, servants to evil, and they were his enemy. He did not hesitate, cry, or grieve. He did not pause or reconsider his actions. Instead, he fought, to protect his allies and himself from the enemies that had destroyed the peace. He was only a man, yet he fought against the shadowed elves. He sank into his warrior's mindset and forgot the past of his foes, the thoughts survive and protect becoming his mantra. He killed and defended, and killed again, as ruthless as a man facing orcs. This was the enemy, and they must be defeated. There was no place for mercy or hesitation here. A sharp thrust killed another shadowed elf, a quick block saving an ally from death. He stepped forward, parrying the next strike, and cut off his enemy's head. Boromir turned and was forced to duck in order to avoid a swinging sword, the shadowed elf's expression promising nothing but pain and death. Suddenly, he was clumsy and slow in comparison to the creature before him. This shadowed elf used to his new strength and power. The man was forced to defend himself, barely blocking each quick, deadly, intentional blow. His enemy was smirking, baring his teeth, playing with the human, an orc with an elf's face and a demon's eyes. Then the shadowed elf cried out, a sword sticking from his chest, and he fell to reveal Elladan standing there, solemn and grim. The warriors the older twin had gathered joined the fray, armed, dangerous, and with the same grim expressions as the dark-haired elves. Fighting became easier then, the twin watching the man's back as they faced the enemies that had come from within. All was lost in the haze and chaos of battle, the enemies steadily becoming harder to kill as the Shadow Elves realized their new ability and strength. If a blow did not take them down immediately, they would still fight, ignoring their wounds as if they did not even exist. One thing was for certain. Whatever darkness had taken over these elves had greatly changed them, both in body and in mind. They were now faster, stronger, and more durable than their kin. A flash of black in the corner of his eye made him turn to see another shadowed elf standing beneath the arch that was the entrance to the hidden valley. Behind them, clearly visible beneath the still shining sun, was an army of orcs. Boromir must have made a sound, a gasp or horrified intake of breath, for many of his allies turned in the same direction as he, freezing as they spotted the dark army ready to invade. Beneath the blazing sun that no longer harmed them, the army of orcs hesitated just outside the hidden valley. One stood right at the edge of the bridge, a single step forward enough to bring him into the sanctuary that none of his kind had ever entered. Yellow eyes glared at the elves fighting their shadowed enemies in the courtyard, obviously eager to join the battle. However, he still hesitated, his kin lingering behind him, as if he were afraid that an invisible force would kill them all if they took a single step further. The need for blood warred with a feeling of self-preservation, but as an unarmed, still light elf screamed and died on a shadowed elf's blade, one side won out and demolished the other. A foot lifted, a boundary was passed, and the first orc stepped into Imladris. Legolas was in pain. He floated between consciousness and blackness, unwilling to enter the living world but unable to sink into oblivion. Either option would be preferable to the state he found himself in now. Here, somewhere in between, he was unaware of his body, but he felt pain. He did not know where the flares of hurt rippling through him came from, but his entire being felt as if they were being torn apart. Knives stabbed and twisted within him, ripping and tearing at him without a care for the one who was trapped in silent agony. Deep within him, a war was being waged, two sides clashing. Something was changing, shifting within him, and for a beat of heart-stopping fear, he thought an enemy was invading to enter his mind. He tried to sense his shields, to bring them up and protect himself, only to realize that they were intact. Whatever was attacking him was already inside. Legolas floundered in the blackness, lost in a sea of confusion and pain. Here he had no sense of direction, not knowing up, down, left, or right, any more than a blind man knew colors. A flicker of something, push, strain, hold, escape, calm, chaos, contain, trapped, caught his attention, and he turned, pushing the pain away as best he could. Not far away was white light, shining, beautiful, and calm. No, not calm. It writhed and rippled, fighting and grim, as it fought to contain something within it. Blurs of colors were trapped within the light, pulsing against its prison and struggling to escape. Flares of every hue, from red to brown to periwinkle, rippled and swarmed in the light, intriguing, wonderful, and nauseating all at once. They swirled dizzily as they tried to gain momentum and escape, only for the light to hold fast and keep them imprisoned. Watching the two forces battle, Legolas realized that they were the source of his pain. They were the reason he felt like he was being torn apart. The light and the colors, two pieces of himself, fought bitterly, one seeking freedom while the other sought to keep its prisoner contained. Fire coursed through the elf with every clash and defense, the feeling of being ripped in half strengthening. It was too much. He knew if the war continued, he would be destroyed, through death, madness, or eternal darkness he did not know. A bolt of utter blackness swamped him, but he pushed out of it, struggling like a drowning man. Desperately, he tried to analyze the light and the colors, needing to pick a side to assist. Once he did, the battle would end, the light or the colors emerging victorious. He had no idea what the haphazard mix of colors and hues could be, but the light was much easier to identify. It was a bright, brilliant light, burning strongly and determinedly as it kept the colors contained and the darkness away. He instinctively knew that this was a part of his very soul, his contained elvish glow. But what could his inner light be imprisoning? What could it be keeping locked away in his body, soul, or mind? Another wave of blackness washed over him, but he fought free of it. The assassin stared intently at the colors, noting that they were not quite blurs, but colored strands woven together. His agony was forgotten, and excitement rose inside him. His inner light protected his body, soul, and mind, and had been for years, ever since he had lost his memories. Could his light be protecting them as well, even from himself, by keeping them locked away? Had he accidentally taken away, contained, his own memories when he had created his mental shield with his glow? In Dol Guldur, if he had been who he was before, he would not have survived. So had he intentionally cut off that part of himself to protect himself? There was only one way to find out. Wary against hoping, but knowing with each step he was right, Legolas ran towards the light and the struggling colors, towards his memories. They were right there. They had been there the whole time. He could reach them now, see them, remember them. He could remember who he had been. Something wrapped around his middle, and he jerked to a halt, as abrupt as a falling creature was stopped by a rope around his waist. Legolas struggled against the white light, not his light, that held him fast. His fighting became desperate as the light tugged at him, trying to pull him away. "No!" he cried soundlessly, writhing and pulling against his bond, reaching out desperately towards the colored strands. "Please, no!" His memories were right in front of him, inches from his fingertips. He strained, unable to gain ground. More light ropes wrapped around his torso, pulling strongly, and he became distantly aware of a voice chanting something. In the back of his mind, he recognized a healing spell, but he ignored it, fighting against the ropes with all his strength. Even more ropes came, binding him, and began to slowly but surely drag him away from his goal. Legolas did not have the ability to cry in this place, but despair ripped through him as painfully as a knife. He cursed, struggled, pleaded with the ropes to release him, to please let him go. They and the voice commanding them did not listen. The assassin gave a scream of grief as the distance between himself and his memories grew greater. He needed something, anything from his past, a fact, an instinct, a flicker, anything at all. Legolas strained and fought, begged and wailed, but his will and strength were not enough against the insistent ropes that caught him. His memories became distant, the light fading, and with a desperate heave, he yanked against the ropes, hands stretching uselessly towards them. A single colored strand slipped through the protective light, floating gently through the nothingness between Legolas and his memories. He watched its path hungrily, desperation in his violet eyes as it floated closer, closer. It hovered near him, following as the ropes pulled him back, as if it were hesitant to give him what he wanted, what he needed. "Please," the assassin thought, stretching as far as he could. With careful, whisper-like grace, the string touched his fingertip. The reaction was instantaneous, an almost physical pulse making him lose all sense of self. A feeling of painful blackness swamped him, and for an instant he remembered nothing. All memory and all things that made him him abandoned him. His mind wiped clean. "Who am I? What am I? Where am I? What happened?" he screamed in terror, because there was nothing left. Mercifully, his loss only lasted a moment, and before he could even comprehend it, his mind and his memories, precious, so precious, valor, they had all been gone, returned. He felt heavy and weak, like he was waking after being heavily ill. He tried to open his eyes, but his body refused to obey him, so he remained limp and unmoving as he was carried. Arms were wrapped around him, carrying him along, and he could hear the muffled sounds of harsh breathing and someone speaking. Yes, someone was talking. Could they be speaking to him? The assassin was so confused. The voice was panicked and frantic, yet familiar. For a moment he could not place it, but he eventually recognized Radagast's fearful tones. But why was the brown wizard so afraid? Were they being attacked or pursued? Were they in danger? If so, Legolas decided that he really should open his eyes. But he was so tired. "Breathe, Esgal!" Radagast was shouting. "Breathe!" Legolas could only mull over his confusion. The distance between his body and mind lingered, but he belatedly realized that his chest was burning. With a sharp gasp, the assassin pulled air into his lungs, pain rippling down his airway as it was used once more. "Good," Radagast encouraged. voice shaking slightly. "Very good. Don't worry, Esgal. We're almost to the palace. The healers will help you. You'll be fine." The Istar's voice was fading, but the assassin did not mind. He did not wonder what had happened, or why the wizard was so concerned. All that mattered was a single fact that had appeared in his mind, retrieved after being contained for so long. The memory he had gained was useless, unspecific, and the most unimportant thing he could have remembered. But it was something. Legolas felt himself smile, a weak, barely noticeable movement of his lips. "I had a pet rabbit named Floppy," the assassin thought bemusedly. Then all thoughts fled, and everything faded to black.